For as long as I could remember, I was obsessed with sitting with my grandmother and asking her a million questions about what it was like for her to grow up. What were her parents like, her grandparents like, anything. It made me feel so much more connected to my roots, knowing especially because I didn't grow up in India. And so for me, hearing those stories just brought so much more belonging. When we lose someone we love, we often realize how many of their stories we never asked and we never wrote down or never preserved. And those stories that become our heritage, our ancestry, and our traditions, they don't just shape who we are, but they also connect us to one another as humans. My guest today, Anika Chara, is the CEO and co-founder of Root and Seed, a platform that's reimagining how we preserve and share stories across generations. After 2 decades leading global advertising agencies, Anika experienced the sudden loss of her mother, which set her on a journey of collecting and documenting family stories. That grief turned into purpose, inspiring the creation of Root and Seed alongside her co-founder, Jennifer Saripong Mendel. Today, Root and Seed is bringing storytelling not into homes and schools and workplaces, but it's also creating an honor of legacy and understanding of ancestry and celebrating the connections that bind us all together. Anika is a keynote speaker and a workshop facilitator, and she's actually worked with organizations such as Adobe, the Home Depot, and Harvard Business School and Yale School of Management. In this conversation, we'll talk about why legacy and ancestry matter, not just for families, but for our communities and our society. We'll explore how reconnecting with our roots helps us build stronger relationships, more empathy, and deeper human connection. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives, the podcast where we challenge traditional thinking and explore the power of empathy in conscious leadership, personal growth, and human connection. I'm Dr. Payal Beri, and in each episode, we dive into thought-provoking conversations that expand perspectives and spark transformation. Because empathy reframes perspectives. Let's begin. Anika, it's such a pleasure to have you on. I'm so excited to talk to you because everything that you are doing with your company, with Roots and Seed, and just what you stand for around ancestry and legacy, this literally runs through my veins. Like, it is part of who, like, everyone in my family knows that I am the person that will ask a million questions about why did this happen and why did that happen and who's this grandparent and what's that great grandparent. It's like everyone just gets so tired and sick of me, but I think it's so important. So I'm so excited to hear from you about what prompted you. And I want to just go ahead and dive in and ask you, why does understanding your ancestry, legacy, and roots matter so much to you that you built a business around it?
Oh, I love it, and I love the way you framed that question, actually. I'll be honest, I think I've always been a bit of a nostalgic person, and I've always had a deep respect for the people around me in my family. Like, I got a real chance to get to know my paternal grandparents very well, my maternal grandmother through trips to India every 2 years with my parents. And I always just loved sitting at their knees, sitting on the floor while they were sitting on the chairs and listening to stories like you were saying, and I just soaked up all that time with them. My parents were immigrants and they were coming to this country, and the grandparents were a big support. I used to spend Saturdays and Sundays at my grandmother's house, and I learned how to pray sitting beside her. And so just by nature of that amount of time, I think I've always had a deep respect for the people around me, especially the elders. But there's something very different, as you, I think, eloquently articulated in your question, between having an interest and starting an incomplete business on something. So thank you for asking it the way that you did. We started Root and Seed out of a personal need, which is honestly how so many wonderful platforms and businesses are started. I was compelled by the sudden loss of my mom at the age of 72, 6 years ago. And I realized in an instance that the person who was the matriarch of our family, the kin keeper of our family, the person who held the ways that we practiced the traditions and did the recipes and brought the family together, that she was gone. And that proximity and lack of proximity now to my culture ended up being a place of real sadness and regret. And I felt like I hadn't taken that time to really understand and document those things. that I felt that I really needed at a time when I was deep in grief. And so that's my story. And my business partner came to this idea very separately, in that she comes from a mixed background and was in a household that assimilated, which is also a very common
Mhm.
narrative. And so in her situation, her dad's Thai, mother is Boston Irish. And in her situation, she knew very little about her Thai background. And so, for very different reasons, we came together with this need and desire to fill in the blanks. In my situation, I went right to my father and got him to write everything down forcibly, asked all the questions of the family members to fill in the gaps that my mom, had left in her absence. And in Jen's case, she started to have these really meaningful conversations with her father for the first time as an adult. And we realized that it really was that sandwich generation, the second generation that needed to step up, that we couldn't rely once again on our parents' generation to carry the traditions forward, that it really was our responsibility. Small r, not big R, maybe. Like, if you wanted to keep this going on, that we had to step up. And that's what really compelled us both, for very different reasons, to come together and launch Root and Seed. And the probably the most satisfying thing is just the possibilities and the channels and the places that we get to show up now. We are in over kitchen tables, but we are just as equally in the community centers, in workplaces, in home care situations, in retirement homes, in long-term care. And just that has been the most delightful thing. Is it started from a personal need, probably moved into the kitchen table, and then just organically has grown just out of this curiosity that people have, and this desire to get to know their stories more intimately.
I think that's just so beautiful because when you're talking about that opportunity to ask your dad reluctantly, him sharing, and I find that a lot with the fathers, right? The immigrant fathers who don't always open up. They're very shut. And I find that even in my own home, I know so much about my mother's side of the family. My father's side, not as much. I try to pry, but I think there's also pain and there's also wounds that you're opening the door to things that we think of it as nostalgically and exciting because it's, oh, I want to know these things. But as we're even asking those questions of our parents, it may bring up things for them that they never really resolved or they never really understood for themselves. And it may bring up emotions that they're not ready to even process, even at that age. And so, hearing those stories and those perspectives, I find it to be so gentle in your approach with them. How do you approach and how do you help the individuals in the home cares and the nursing cares and all these places? How do you help them approach those questions in a way that's loving, curious, but also gentle?
With a lot of care. I think you nailed it. This is not for everybody, and I get that. And it's interesting because we have a platform, right? So we have everything from a podcast where we and a very robust blog, all the way to the tools. And sometimes people just want to listen to the stories of others and they get inspired that way. And once in a while, they'll ask, a more pointed question to dig deeper, but they're not ready to unearth all those things. And I get that. I understand that everybody's on a completely different development of their journey of understanding themselves better. I think it starts with us, the people who are asking the questions. Tending to yourself is very important. When you're talking about home care, we have a very robust kinkeeper training that lets the caregiver know that they need to tend to their own emotions before they even start asking the clients of anything. And so making sure that you are in a place where you are emotionally neutral as possible, that you know that at some point you may or may not get triggered and you're ready to close out a session or pivot a topic that may not be very comfortable for yourself. So I think making sure that you really tend to yourself is really important, whether you are the grandchild, the niece, or the professional caregiver, or the colleague in a workplace. You want to make sure that you're tending to yourself first. And that means readying yourself, making sure you're in a neutral place, all those other things. But in the moment, having those skills, and that's what the kinkeeper training does, is how do you pivot things? How do you get people off topics? All those other things. And then there's this wonderful thing that I really credit some of the social workers that have worked with us on closing rituals. So when you're done a session, whether that's you light a candle at the beginning of the session and then you blow out the candle at the end, or you boil a cup of tea, or you do something to signify that, okay, we're going to end and we're going to leave those emotions in that environment. I
Yeah.
think that is really important. And our prompts that we've worked with cultural linguists and cognitive linguists and all these wonderful experts to come up with are very purposefully broad. And you may have something like, what was your childhood like? But then we've got these dig deepers that happen in our technology on our web app that allows you to go in different places, whatever's comfortable for someone. We're not trying to be tricky, or you think of a situation where a journalist is trying to lead the story. You're actually very purposefully trying to be broad and open. And sometimes that allows the person who's answering the question to take it in the way that they want to and in their journey. And so I think for many ways, you have to be super careful about the way that you really introduce this, how you tend yourself while you're going through things, how you close out the session, and then how you use these prompts in a really open and inviting and open for interpretation type of way. So I think those are the real reasons and ways that you can actually be very open about to doing this carefully.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know because, and a lot of what you're saying is like something that in the framework that I've developed, reframed perspectives, where I say compassion for self, empathy for others, and accountability for both. And part of the way that you have empathy, which is what a lot of what you're talking about, is that in my journey of wanting to know my legacy, I need to have empathy for the person who I'm sharing this with and who I'm asking of this. And that requires me to also decenter myself,
Yes.
that it's not about, even though this is information that is about my heritage and me, it is still a story that is shared by this elderly, this other individual. I think about something that you mentioned earlier about the sandwich generation and about learning and the experience. And something that really resonates is that we take for granted what's in front of us until it's gone and what you experienced with your mom. And I just, whenever someone says the past is the past, leave it in the past, it doesn't matter. What is that? What is your response to that? What is your response to those who aren't willing or don't see that actually learning the history of our ancestral past can be so beneficial to the way that we're even leading in our family dynamics or the things that we take forward with ourselves?
I think you end up going through the world blindly, in my opinion. And I think you also touched on this concept of ownership of stories. And I think that's just as important. So by unearthing the stories doesn't mean you have to carry the stories forward. And that
Ooh,
and
say that
that's where we're
again.
okay. By unearthing the stories, by giving them air, asking the questions, it doesn't mean you have to own them. And that is why we're called root and seed. Because root is about the past, okay? But seed is about what you're planting for the future.
Oh, I
And
love that. That is so beautiful. Sorry, that is so beautiful because you're so right. So much of what we think is that when I hear this, now it's almost like it's dumped on me and now I have to hold and carry this. But what you're saying is that I can still choose to take forward what I want.
mhm, exactly. And then we have the ampersand in the root and seed, which is your and my generation, who, whether we have children or not, doesn't matter. We're legacy minded, right? We know that the actions that we're doing today will have a impact on the world, on the earth, on all the things around us. It has nothing to do with even having parents who are alive or children of your own. It really doesn't matter. But you have to be legacy minded and curious, to your point earlier about that curiosity. And I think it's a misnomer to think that if you are collecting the stories that you need to do it blindly and you need to do it with a sense of obligation or it has to be done. And those are old ways of thinking, I think. And I like to adopt this notion and idea of sifting and sorting, which I know is a mindset term. It's not my term, but it's a term of if I know and I can give air to the stories and I can collect the stories, then I can sift through them and sort through them to decide what I want to take forward. But you can't do that if you don't know. If you don't have the stories, to your point on you often don't think about these things until it's too late. If you're not active about it, if you don't have agency around it, if you're not aware of these things, then they end up being in a situation where you have that regret that I didn't take the time to add that information. And you don't have to do this to be a great person and live a great, wonderful life. But I think there's so many clues in the past that can be, and that there's diamonds and there's rubble, if you will.
Yeah.
And so sometimes those wonderful diamonds, which are those heirlooms, are those things you want to take forward. And the rubble, the legacy burdens, are the things that you want to take and you want to let go of. And that this is internal family systems theory. This is not a root and seed theory. This is IFS saying that there's legacy burdens and then there's heirlooms. And if you don't take the time to do some of that work with our parents and elders being that source or one parts of a source of that information, then I think you're missing a big part of yourself. Now, I will also say, because it's very important that I know that there's people in our communities who are adoptees or don't have that strong relationship with their parents that they can ask these questions. And I think if you adopt this community cultural mindset, you can get just as much information from what our cultural background has gone through. In my case, what partition felt and looked like. And you can talk and you can attach and find those stories in some of the literature that's written about that time, which unbeknownst to you, you're still carrying in your bones, whether you like it or not, because it really is something that we carry still. So I just want to make sure it's clear that you don't have to have rosy pictured white picket fence relationship with your families. In fact, most people don't. It's too bad if you don't feel like you can look to the past for some clues. It's sort of a shame if you don't have the courage to look at the past
Yeah.
with that discerning eye.
No,
Yeah.
there's so many things that you touched on that I want to point out, and I'm going to try my best to not ask you all in one jumbled way. But the first thing is when you talk about how by knowing the past and all those things, I relate it to context, right? I relate it to historical context, family context, and empathy is ultimately about context. It's about understanding and understanding perspectives. When you're trying to understand and you see in your own family dynamics, like why there's friction between two cousins or the personality elements that come up. And when you're able to take it back to those moments, it becomes like this awakening that you can have. And I actually consider knowing your family legacy or knowing your cultural legacy as much of an internal anchor as what religion may be to some people and what,
Mhm.
a certain level, like when you talk about values, right? When in an organization, when they talk about their mission statement and their values, those are anchor spots for people to always go back to. Why is it that
Mhm.
religion is something that people really lean into in moments of vulnerability? It's because it's an anchor for people to go into. It's something that they can get answers from. I'm not religious, I'm spiritual for sure, but I look at the fact that I have such a rich understanding of my past family and their roots and what they went through and the partition and all of those pieces that it feels
Mm.
like an anchor for me. And before we started talking, I was mentioning to you how I'm chosen to be child free. And to your point about legacy, what people don't realize is because I don't think I even have it on my website really, but RK empathy, the RK is my maternal grandmother's initials, Raj Kushalia.
Mm.
And
Okay.
the reason why is so I have this very close, intimate bond with her. She's been gone for 11 years now, but we
Mm.
share the exact same birthday, January 11th. So we're 60 years apart. So, of course, I just naturally thought that out of the 17 cousins, I had to be her favorite because I share her birthday. But all my cousins lived in India around her. Me and my brother were the only ones who were outside of India. So we would come back every 2 years and visit and spend our summers and winters there. And she knew, she goes, here comes Pyle with her million questions. But it was because of me knowing, and she loved it. She loved the fact that she got to share about her parents and her grandparents. And she went through the partition. She moved to India 3 years prior to the partition because her father was actually working for the government and knew what was going to happen. So he moved
Okay.
them in advance. So they didn't have to go through some of that tension that they had. So knowing those things, knowing these elements that they didn't have to experience what my father's side did with they actually did live in refugee camps when they came over to the India side from Pakistan because they didn't know, and how that you see the differences in the relationships. But anyways, when I go to and talk about my grandmother, my mom's side, that RK is because I saw the resilience this woman had, the her being the matriarch, the glue of everything. I saw what she did. I saw what she told me about what her mother was like and all of this. And so I actually have the
Mhm.
tattoo, RK, on my wrist, and I have 3 or 6 dots, and the 6 dots, I don't think you can see it here, but, like, the 6 dots essentially are 3 are dedicated to the women in my family who came before me that created
Mm.
the narratives and had the stories that led me to becoming who I am today, and 3 dots are for the future for my nieces or for a community and just the neighborhoods or whoever it is where I can say that because of what I am doing today with RK Empathy, with the work that I do, the purpose that I fulfill, it is to create legacy for them. So everything you're saying is something that I just feel so strongly about. It's literally how I've intentionally built my business.
I love that. I think you need to be your spokesperson. Done.
Done. I'm here for it. I mean, I'm a
Promise.
sucker for Ancestry.com. I'm a sucker for Roots. Like, I'm a sucker for all of those. Even the other piece that you touched on about the partition, that is something we had another podcast guest, Dr. Amara Khalid, who's actually writing
Mhm.
a book about the
Love that.
ancestral partition and the generational trauma and the stories that we still carry today in our families because of the partition that happened in the South Asian diaspora. So, first of all, I think she'd be fantastic for you to talk to. But
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
it really is that I think about all of this, what you're doing, what I'm talking about, and I think about it from that perspective as well of what is happening in our world today and the things that are happening. And there's that saying where history gets lost after 3 generations, and that's why we tend to repeat it again. And
Mm.
so, what would you say is the benefit of people understanding our cultural history and our cultural legacy that could actually help us move differently in our world today, in our communities today, so that it's not forgotten?
I mean, I think you touched on it when you said the world, sorry, the word anchor, right? It's so much of the world feels untethered right now. I think we feel, where do we belong? And even if you feel a sense of belonging somewhere, it doesn't feel authentic and real and aligned a lot of the times. And I think people are questioning a lot right now. And I think the pandemic absolutely was a timeout for everybody. And I think obviously everything else that's going on that we don't need to get into, but I think certainly your listeners will understand what we're talking about. And so I think it provides some clarity around how people move through the world before and maybe perhaps some optimism. You say something about the kind of the 3 generations and as many lows as there have been certainly highs. And I think if you are truly embracing a world of empathy, which you're calling upon your community to do, you've got to do it with that sense of awareness and optimism. There has to be like that layer of it. And I think as sad as the history can be for so many people's cultures, there is so much that can be gleaned and learned from how people were resilient during those moments and times and the attributes and things that they did learn. And as much as I like to be honest about that generational trauma, I find that more times than not, especially right now, that I'm trying to lean more into the greatness that has happened from our ancestors versus the sadness. but I feel like I've earned a right to be able to do that because I've wallowed enough in the sadness.
Yeah.
I've been really honest with my journey and my family's journey, and I've really put a mirror up to myself and worked through a lot of that generational trauma.
And there's
And
stages to that, right? Like, it's okay to say that, yes, we need to first, or maybe you need to first explore the grief or the hardships, because I think part of nostalgia is we put things in a rose-colored glass sometimes, and it literally is our brain function. Our brain nostalgically forgets the pain, and that's why we're like, "Was it really that bad?" And it's, "No, it was." But it's okay to go there and look at that, have the grief, have the anger, have the acceptance, and then also take from it what is beautiful, what is that, like, "Wow, because of this, look what we were able to do." In a way, I think about it that if, for example, if the partition never happened and
Mhm.
my family continued to live where they were in Pakistan and they continued to have the life that they did have, my parents would have never immigrated to the US because they wouldn't have needed to, because they would have had all of the lifestyle and the generational wealth and everything that they had accumulated was all there. My great grandmother was actually her mother was a royal princess, and so she had all of this stuff. And so when my grandfather talks about this, they used to summer at their grandparents' house, which was like a house that was like 50 bedrooms, and it was this and that. That's all left. And when they left and came to the partition and they had to start all over again, and they didn't have any of that anymore. But when I think about if my dad never migrated to the United States because for him there were more opportunities here, then I wouldn't be here. Then we wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah. And can you imagine what they're like? That generation is looking down from wherever they are, going, these two brown girls are getting together and they're having this conversation, and thousands of people are going to listen to this story. And it's such a cool idea. I love to think about how they're like looking down on us and thinking about that. Yeah. I mean, I think facing some of those attributes is really important. It's funny, like when you talk about partition and generational trauma and those type of things, that one of the first things that comes to my mind that I don't think I realized until almost I was done my corporate career after 25 years being in advertising was the deep in my bones sadness that I
Mm,
used to feel when things ended. When clients fired us as an agency, or when projects were even completed, even if they were done successfully, I always had this deep sense of loss, and it was because my mother and her family left everything in the middle of the night and had to walk over the border and had to have everything stripped from them. And so it was my physical body would actually go into like my nervous system would be really disrupted. And I don't think I realized that truly was in my bones until I really started to understand that. And it revealed so much about my mother's personality. And I love how you contrasted your mother's side and your father's side. I actually have a very similar story where my dad was in East Africa, so they did not deal with partition into
wow, yeah.
and so his personality is a lot more laid back, is a lot more like cool as a cucumber. He like befriends everybody. And my mom had a way more of a fire in her and a lot more determined, but also very skeptical about people and things. And
Mhm.
so I could contrast both of their personalities based on their lived experience and all those things that I would hold in my own lives as I moved through the world, no matter if it was how I dealt with relationships or how I showed up as a leader at work. And yeah, it's just clues like those. I just think it's so sad if you don't actually take the time to understand those things. But I also,
Yeah, and
it's not everybody's.
no, totally, but I think that that if it isn't someone's jam or someone dismisses it, it's like, what are you afraid of?
Yeah.
What is it that because I do think that there is this element that when we talk about those like, "Oh, you're just too emotional, you're too attached to this," and it's like, yeah, there is some piece of the fact that there is a danger of staying too much in the past, and you do have to think forward as well, but I love the way that you talk about roots and seed because it isn't about just staying in the past and creating a narrative that is focused on the past. It's more about understanding the past, understanding that narrative, carrying forward with it what you will, which is what a lot of immigrants do. A lot
Mhm.
of immigrants, if we think about our parents who came and migrated to Canada, to the US, a lot of them were stuck in the mindset of India in the 70s, the 60s, the 80s, whenever they left it. It's like they were stuck in that generation of it, like that they want to preserve. And there was so much fear of, oh my gosh, I'm raising my kids in this Western culture and we want them to still hold on to so much of what we have. So sometimes they actually become even more strict,
Mm.
more conservative than the family members who are back home.
So true.
And then, then we as the sandwich generation in immigration, where the next generation who are a little more adjusted because they're born and raised here and they've got parents who've already gone through the adjustment. So we understand okay, I get that you want to go to a high school dance and I'm not going to say no to you because you're a girl. It's that part also of what I love what you talk about is the empowerment
Mhm.
in the roots and seeds is the empowerment of the story that I now get to decide how much of the story I want my daughter or my son or the next kin, the next generation to take forward. They blend their story because now I often look at it like as Asian Indians, we are relatively still new to North America. There was an entire population in the 1800s that people don't realize that came here. But if we talk about the more newer generation from the 70s onwards, but what we're experiencing with these next generation is what the Irish or the Italians and everyone else went
Mhm.
through already, the Germans, where they're fourth, fifth, sixth generation removed
That's
from
right.
their place of origin, ethnicity of origin. And
Mm.
now we are seeing that happen in our cultural and realizing that, yes, there is a story of the origin story, but there's also a new story that's being built right now. And that story
Gosh.
of these kids who are going to be third generation removed from a culture. And so now they are building their own version of their culture
Yep,
that is blended.
that's right. Whether we like it or not, so we may as well be informed about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that exposing them to as much as we can feels important. I think about I'm slightly laughing at myself because I think about when my daughter went to university 3, 4 years ago, and, this word "enough" is in my head right now. I'm just gonna share it with you and maybe just go slightly off topic, but still rooted in the roots. How about that? So I'm always and just recently I've been thinking about, have I given them enough? Am I enough? Am I doing enough? Which can be actually rooted in so much. So like in this sort of lack mentality, right? That again we may have inherited from the immigrant mentality and all those other things. Am I enough? But have I given my children enough is something that I'm constantly thinking. Have I given them the tools to go out into the world that they're incredibly independent? I remember when my daughter was leaving and I was like, but she doesn't know how to make these Indian dishes. And I'm thinking, she's going to friggin' university. Why does she need to know how to make these Indian dishes? Or I'm thinking, she doesn't know how to celebrate Diwali, and Diwali's in the middle of early November. It's not even close to US Thanksgiving. So, like, does she know that she needs to light a candle? Like, I went through panic mode thinking, did I do enough? And I think the danger of not understanding this point of view around root and seed is that you may fall into this idea that I have to do things perfectly or I have to do them the way my ancestor did them. Guess what? The kin keepers in our families, they made, can I say shit? I don't know if I can
Yeah,
say shit on this podcast. They made shit
absolutely.
too. They made stuff up too. And in the absence of having an instruction manual from my mother, I've had to make stuff up too. Having it rooted in some semblance of how we did things and the values, back to your point earlier, of how we did things is enough. And I think sometimes the danger might be in this sort of space of matriarch and kin keeping and all those other things to think that you have to do things perfectly. And you really don't. And I think even sometimes having that one story. I have one story from partition. I have one story about my dad's nana. Like I have one, and those often can be almost enough to get the quintessential story or essence of somebody. And I just want to make sure that is comes across because I think this is not about collecting the perfect memoir. To your point, we're going to be more distant away from our cultures and places of origin. And so I think to ask somebody from a background like yours and mine to do the perfect memoir, the soup to nuts, fill in the family tree perfectly like it's a school project, it is unrealistic. What are those stories that we can really embody and carry with us that light us up, that provide us some sense of anchoring, that gives us a clue to what our values are moving forward to build that more empathetic world is where the magic lies.
Oh my gosh, when you're talking, all I could think about is whenever you ask your parents something like, "Why do we do this?" They're like, "We just do it." And it's because they didn't have the answers. And to your point about is she gonna do this or is it enough? I think it's that again, that balance of recognizing that culture is also ever evolving. And if we
Mm,
think about the culture that our great grandparents grew up in, my mom, she is one of 6 siblings. Her
mm,
eldest in the family is, her sister. They're 13 years
mm,
apart. So when she got married, my mom was 12. And when she got married at that time in the 60s in India, she hadn't even arranged marriage. She hadn't even who she was marrying until she got to the mandap, to the
mm,
ceremony space, and her dupatta was all the way down. So her husband didn't even see her until he lifted that was the first time they saw each other. Versus my mom, 13 years later, was allowed to go into a room and talk to my dad for 10 minutes while my grandmother's like listening on the outside. And it's just like actually like knowing. So even that piece, like if we hold on to this idea of our traditions are this, our roots are this, then it
mm,
keeps us stagnant. It keeps us from
mm,
ever
mm.
evolving and seeing then being accepting of the changes. It creates some resistance. And I think that's where the rigidity or tension between generations can come in, where if we look at tradition and we look at the roots more as, wow, I respect what you had to go through for the time and context of what was going on at that time. And thank
Yes.
you for doing what you did and receiving that as a gratitude, even though you may not understand it because we live in such a different time than when that existed. But if we can just have compassion for the decisions that they had to make at the time that they were going through, then we can take that and we don't have to carry it in a way where it's now we're disrespecting them. And I think that at the core of everything you're talking about is respecting the elders of what they had to go through, their stories, and also recognizing that their stories are their perception of that story. Someone else and a family member, a cousin of theirs, they may have a completely different story because we're all moving through the world based off of what we are perceiving. So this cultural element that we're talking about and what you're experiencing with your daughter, like, your daughter is going to think about maybe not in her 20s, but when she gets to her 30s and 40s, like she will start thinking about, oh, yeah, what do I want to carry forward for
Mm.
kin as well? But it's this I think that if we can have respect and we can carry that context of that, it allows us to feel a little bit lighter about what we are taking forward.
I absolutely agree. I have to share one of our written CD users. So you should know our platform's entirely, especially our technology, is private and secure. And so the podcast is very different. Obviously, podcast people want to share their stories. But this is a written CD user who interviewed her mother in law. And she purposely decided to do this because she just wanted to get to understand her a little bit better. So she had a bit of a curiosity that I want to understand her journey a little bit better. She'd fallen sick, and so she wanted to think about what is something that she could make sure the grandchildren knew about their grandmother. And it's interesting because she unearthed all these incredible stories, and then she reflected on her personality traits. And this written CD user said to us that she used to always just get really upset when the mother-in-law wouldn't receive gifts. Like her birthday is in December and they would always want to give her all these gifts and she would take the gift and then she would go like right to the store and return it. And her other sister-in-law were always like, well, she's being really like mean. Like she doesn't like our taste and all the other things that go through your mind. And then through understanding the complexity of her upbringing and the gender stereotypes as she was growing up, because her mother-in-law's in her her 80s, is she realized that she never thought that she deserved gifts. Right? Like, she never
Mhm.
really realized, and so she couldn't receive. Forget, it had nothing to do with the daughter-in-laws. It had nothing to do with those 2 women and their taste or anything like that, but talk about building empathy. It was a small, like, example, but I think it just unlocked an entirely different way of perceiving that generation, and all of a sudden, you feel an empathy towards the woman because she just doesn't know that she deserves to receive. And so her immediate response is, I need to return it back. And I need to, and it's not out of meanness or disrespect. It's just like all of a sudden, I just don't deserve it. And so
Mm.
it unlocked a relationship that I don't think she would ever, had she not had the tools and the agency and the curiosity to get to know her mother-in-law better, in a very typical mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. Doesn't matter what your culture is. I can tell you, I have friends from all sorts of different relations, cultural backgrounds, and there's that stereotype of the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. And so I think it's building the capacity to think about people differently than what you know about them today is one of the gifts and the magic of unearthing some of the stories from the past, is like knowing them as a different person and at the different roles that they had at different times in their lives, and some of the limitations societally and culturally that they had to face as they were growing up.
Wow. All of this brings me to asking you, what action can someone take today? What small action, if this is something that's relatively new to them, they're curious, but they're not sure how to, what is something that how can they take action to get closer to understanding their roots and heritage?
My immediate thought when you ask that question is, so we won a silver at the Anthem Awards last year for digital innovations that help social and mental health and wellness benefits. So the fact that we won in that
Amazing.
category is really special to me, and
Yeah.
that's why I bring it up. But our tagline when we announced it was, call an elder and ask them something else than what's the weather like. Like, just literally anything about their background is just the most simplest way to just get to a deeper level of understanding between generations. So I would say that's just a way of doing things. And then I would say we're moving into the fall season, we're moving into the holiday season. And I would say gatherings are going to be more prevalent, and adding some element of play through conversation cards, whether there are conversation cards or anybody else's, doesn't matter, but putting some structure and purpose around gatherings, I think is really beautiful and magical. I often bring mine out for Thanksgiving, and I love that the younger generation, the ones in their early teens, and the older generations, the one in their 80s, have just as much to answer when it comes to these questions and input. And all of a sudden, it democratizes the conversation that happens in families. And so what it does is it allows everybody to feel like they have an ability to, whether you're loud or not loud, or you're more quiet to yourself, is to make sure that everybody does have a voice at their family gatherings. And I think that may be another thing that I can leave the audience with, is just the sense of adding a little bit of purpose and intention around some of the family gatherings that are going to be happening this fall and Christmas season.
I can't wait. I definitely plan on using your cards and in those because everyone knows me in the family already as the person who's going to ask the question. So might as well continue with leaning into that. And finally, if you could reframe one thing about the way that we view ancestry and legacy and heritage, what would that reframe be?
I feel like our whole entire conversation was about reframing. So I kudos to you, Pyle, for just asking the most brilliant questions around it. Reframe around ancestry. Okay, I've got it. Something that we haven't touched on yet. I think that there is a misnomer around this being a one and done activity. The idea is often people say, oh, I've done my memoir, or I've done the book, and it sits on the shelf and it collects dust. And it's only opened when someone passes or when some other occasion happens, a significant birthday or an anniversary, or there's some sort of memorial. One thing we didn't talk about explicitly in this conversation was how much workplaces are using what we're doing
Yes.
in our tools. And it's no surprise to me that people are wanting to understand their childhood and family stories, to understand themselves better, but in a very active way. Do this often, unearth these stories often, and do that sifting and sorting that we talked about earlier as a active awareness, like on the every quarter type of thing. And you can do that in a workplace, in a group environment, because you want to understand what are the stories that we're carrying from even our organizational past, but what do we want to take forward is just as equally valuable as unearthing the stories from your childhood. And so I would just say the biggest thing that I would love to leave the audience with is this idea of being really active and aware and doing this often versus it being one and done.
I love that. You're right, because we're ever evolving and we can look at these stories from such different ways. I think about the book, or not the book. I think it was a book first, but there was that movie that was made and it was beautiful. It's an Indian movie, a Bollywood movie, Zubaydah.
Mhm.
And it was all about the director in the movie going everywhere to learn as much as possible about his mother, who had a very turbulent and very dynamic life. The way that movie was shot was just so beautiful because he was hearing her about her, who he never got to really know,
Mm.
from different family members and different people who knew her in
Yes.
all the complexities that she was. So it wasn't just shaping her in this one way. And then it was talking about her from her being and what she was like as a young kid to what she was like as an adult to what she was like as an elder.
Mm.
And he got to learn this dynamic version, and so when you talk about that this isn't just a one-time thing, it's so true because we're evolving, and
Mm.
to learn about who that person is and we don't get stuck of seeing them from that one light is so beautiful. So thank you so much, Anika, for coming on and for sharing this I could talk to you about this for hours. And there's just such a shared interest in this and respect for
Mhm.
that ancestry and that culture and the roots that we have. So thank you, first of all, for taking your interest and taking this into making it into something that now people can utilize with Roots and Seeds. Where can people get in touch with you? How can they connect with you? And how can they receive the beautiful gift that you have created through Roots and Seeds?
Thank you so much. You can find us at rootandseed.com, and it is the holiday season. So these are make incredible gifts. We love to read when people write personal stories and personal notes too. They're the people that are receiving the gifts. Oftentimes you'll see like it's somebody's 80th birthday and it's happy birthday, dad. We can't wait to collect our stories together. And it's just such a wonderful sentiment as opposed to once again putting the pressure on the elder generation to do this in isolation. So yes, rootandseed.com. We're on socials at Root and Seed Co. So it's Root and Seed, not plural. And yeah, we can be hired for workshops in corporate. We do keynote speaking. I'm a speaker myself. And so there's just so many different ways. But if you just wanted to get in touch with me and chat about family history, my inbox is always open. And I can be reached at Anika at rootandseed.com. So please just drop me a line.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anika.
No worries. Thank you.
I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.